My name is Martha Keller, 71 years old, a widow who spent her entire life caring for her only son. People like to say, have children so you'll have someone to lean on in old age. For me, that line turned out to be the deepest knife. I paid their rent for 3 years, filled their fridge when there was nothing left to eat, and quietly sold off keepsakes from my late husband, so my son and daughter-in-law wouldn't go without. And yet, on the most important day of his life, the wedding, I heard 3 words that still stab at my heart. Special people. I wasn't one of them. But don't mistake this for a simple story about a betrayed mother. No, this is the journey of how I went from being treated like a walking wallet to holding my head high and reclaiming my freedom, my dignity, and yes, peace in my own heart. And you won't believe it. Just when I thought I'd lost everything, the story took a turn no one saw coming. Please subscribe, turn on the notification bell, share this story, and leave a comment where you're listening. Now, come back with me to that morning when my daughter-in-law smiled coldly and said, "We already got married yesterday." My name is Martha Keller, 71 years old, a widow, living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. People like to say old age is when your children come back to take care of you. But for me, old age feels like a quiet courtroom where every dollar I gave is turned into evidence against me. That morning, I picked up the phone, excitement and nerves tangled together. I only wanted to ask my son one simple question. When is your wedding so I can get ready? I'd imagined that moment 1,000 times, a mother in a new dress, standing beside her son, taking a family photo worth keeping forever. But life doesn't look like the wedding cards in the movies. Sophie, my daughter-in-law, didn't wait for David to answer. She lifted her chin, lips curving into a smile that still chills me. We already got married yesterday. Only special people were invited. The room froze. My ears rang, and I could hear every tick of the wall clock. Special people. I, who had covered their rent for 3 years, wasn't one of them. I, who bought every chair and table in their apartment, wasn't special enough. And David? He stared at the floor, avoiding my eyes like a child who stole a cookie and hopes his mother won't notice. But this wasn't a cookie. This was his wedding. A bitter image flashed in my mind. The pale pink dress hanging in my closet, the shoes I bought for the big day, the cash envelope I'd prepared as a gift, all of it lying there like supporting actors cut from the play the night before opening. I used to think sacrifice earned respect. For 3 years I paid their rent, $500 a month, never missed. I lugged suitcases of groceries to fill their empty fridge. I sent money to Sophie under the excuse of personal expenses, knowing full well it was paying for the dress, the rings, even the plane tickets for the honeymoon. I thought the least I'd get was a place in the family photo, but when I opened social media, I saw Sophie in the white dress I helped pay for, standing between her parents, with siblings on both sides raising their glasses. They were the special people. I bit my lip until it bled. Maybe that blood was the same red as the dollars I'd withdrawn over and over to feed this counterfeit happiness. David finally stammered, "Mom, it was just a small ceremony, only a few witnesses. We didn't want to trouble you, didn't want to trouble me. I've spent my whole life being troubled by him. I carried the weight of his youth, his adulthood, and his debts, only to be told I was a burden." Sophie dropped onto the sofa, the very one I paid for, crossed her legs like the lady of the house, and looked at me. The smile, lacquered with red lipstick, held a message she didn't bother to hide. You only matter when your wallet is open. The pain wasn't that I'd been cut out of the wedding. The pain was that I had turned myself invisible in my own son's life. That night I sat alone, staring at the pink dress hanging lonely in my closet. I replayed every dollar I'd spent, the money to fix their AC, the car David promised to make payments on and never did, the medicine, when Sophie pretended to be sick. I added it up. Numbers danced in my head. $30,000. $30,000 to buy myself a spot on the edge of someone else's happiness. I was naive to think love could be purchased. The truth is the opposite. The more I paid, the less I was worth. They didn't see a mother. They saw an unsigned checkbook. When Sophie said special people, it sounded like an indictment, and I understood that for 3 years I'd been wrong. So wrong that in the moment I needed love most, I stood there like an outsider to my own life. And yet strangely, right then a cold seed sprouted in my chest. Not despair, anger. A quiet, steady anger bright enough to light a decision that would later change my life. I looked at the bright wedding photo on the screen, Sophie smiling like a queen, David beside her unable to lift his head, and I whispered, not for anyone else to hear, but to remind myself, special people, and I'm not one of them. That night I sat at my old wooden table, the room lit by a single yellow lamp that felt more like an interrogation light. In front of me, a notebook, a pen, and a pile of memories no one wants to audit. I began to write, not to remember, but to prove to myself that I had willingly turned my life into someone else's wallet. Each number cut like a blade. $500 a month for rent. 3 full years, $18,000. I remember holding each receipt and consoling myself. At least my son has a place to come home to. $200 a month for food, for all the times the fridge was empty and I rushed to the supermarket to fill it with meat, fish, and vegetables. Total, $7,200. Gifts for birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, at least $3,000. I always picked something a bit pricier, believing happiness could be bought by the label on the box. Car repairs for David, $200. Medical emergency for Sophie, that midnight call with tears, $800. Broken AC, another $600. Furniture and household items, sofa, table, kitchenware, over $200. When I underlined the final figure, my hand trembled, but my eyes were dry. Total, nearly $30,000. And where did it come from? From the savings my late husband left, the money meant for my retirement, a modest trip now and then, a little peace after a lifetime of work. I laughed, an arid sound echoing in an empty room. I've become a crying ATM, a special kind of ATM, one that dispenses cash, listens patiently, and offers comfort to the person standing in line to withdraw. People say love has no price, but it certainly has receipts. Mine add up to $30,000, paid in steady installments over 3 years. And what I bought wasn't affection, just contempt. I remembered Sophie's eyes when she said, special people. The look was no different from a bank employee, assessing a customer's credit limit. I wasn't a mother, not a part of the family. I was a balance due. The pain wasn't the money. Money can be earned again. The real bankruptcy was losing my worth in my own son's eyes. I invested a lifetime into David, expecting dividends of love and respect. When harvest time came, all I got was exclusion. A small story came back to me. A few months ago, I handed Sophie $800 for medicine. The next day, she posted a brand new white dress online. I didn't ask. I told myself, as long as my daughter-in-law is happy. In That very dress appeared at the wedding I wasn't invited to. I had funded my own humiliation. When I thought of my husband, Robert, gone 10 years now, a sharp ache tore through me. He worked his whole life, saved every dollar, and left me enough to live out my years in peace. If he could see this, it would break his heart. I'd spent his life's sweat to buy my son's indifference and my daughter-in-law's disdain. But staring at that notebook and its blazing red total, I realized something. I am not an innocent victim. I was an accomplice. I put the chain around my own neck and handed them the key. I taught David that if he asked, money would appear, while I stayed quiet, sacrificed, and chewed on loneliness in the dark. And now the outcome is plain. Cut out of the wedding, dismissed, in the very role of mother. Yet in that bitterness, a small light flickered. If anything was going to change, it had to start with me. If they see love as a transaction, then this bank is closing. I set down the pen, folded the notebook, and whispered to myself like reading a declaration. If I'm not special at my son's wedding, don't expect me to be special at the bank. The next morning, I put on my old coat, tied my hair back, and picked up the small notebook where I'd recorded every dollar I'd poured into the bottomless pit called the young Keller household. The air was crisp, the sky a heavy gray, as if to remind me, it's time to close a chapter. The bank sat on the corner of Main, the place I'd visited at least twice a month. I still knew the feeling of pushing through those doors, the gloss of polished wood, the click of heels from the tellers, the curious glances of people waiting in line. They probably thought I was there to wire more money to my kids. If they knew I'd come to end it all, they wouldn't believe it. I walked straight to the counter and asked for the manager. Mr. Coleman, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, had known me for years. He'd helped me transfer every payment to David and Sophie. For 3 years, he'd been the silent witness to my sacrifice. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. Then the smile faded as soon as I spoke. Mr. Coleman, I want to cancel all automatic transfers. All of them. For a second, I saw him flinch. He was used to the picture of an elderly mother hurrying in, hands shaking as she signed yet another transfer so her kids could make rent. Mrs. Keller, he asked carefully, are you sure? This is a big change. I nodded, my voice steady, more sure than I've ever been. He studied me for a moment, then sighed, as if releasing something he'd been holding back for years. Forgive me if I'm too forward, but I've watched you be very generous for a long time. Sometimes I've wondered whether they care about you or just your money. I gave a thin smile. A stranger, the only person I dealt with through paper bills, cared more for me than my own son. Life has a sense of humor. Mr. Coleman, I said, don't worry, I'm not a walking wallet anymore. We sat and signed the paperwork. When he handed me the final confirmation, it felt like a chain had slipped from my neck. Relief flickered in his eyes. He set a hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Keller, you did the right thing. Some kinds of love aren't worth paying for. I stepped out of the bank, and the sky seemed brighter. No thunderbolt, no one blocking my way with blame. Just me, and a strange, weightless feeling. Relief. Instead of heading straight home, I cut through the nearby park. It had been ages since I took a walk that wasn't for some errand tied to David and Sophie. I moved slowly, letting the wind touch my face, listening to leaves whisper underfoot. Maybe the last time I did this was 10 years ago, when Robert was still alive. I stopped at a small cafe on the corner. Normally, I'd calculate that a few dollars should go toward Sophie's milk or David's electric bill, but today was different. I opened the door and ordered a hot cappuccino. By the window, I watched people hurry past, busy, urgent, each with a story of their own. And for the first time in years, I could sit and drink coffee for myself without feeling guilty. In the cafe's mirror, I caught my reflection. The same aged face, the same web of lines, but the eyes had changed, no longer clouded with resignation, but lit with resolve. I smiled, a rare smile, not for anyone else, just for me. When I got home, I didn't pick up my phone. I knew it would be howling with missed calls, scolding texts and demands. I didn't panic. Instead, I cooked myself a simple dinner, the chicken soup I love, but had abandoned because they don't eat that. That evening, I sat on the sofa, the very one I once paid for. But this time, I sat differently. Not as a mother afraid of being left behind, but as a woman who just reclaimed her first piece of freedom. I thought about all those frantic trips to the bank, about Sophie's midnight sobs demanding a transfer. I shook my head and whispered, like a spell. I transferred money to them for 3 years. Now I'm transferring life back to myself. That afternoon, I took a longer walk around the neighborhood than usual. After years of living as a shadow of my children, I wanted to enjoy the most luxurious thing of all, my own time. When I returned, something felt off. Parked neatly in front of my house was a sleek black car I didn't recognize. Beside it, David's silver sedan and Sophie's familiar red hatchback. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't invited them today. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hurried inside and froze. David sat on the sofa, head bowed like a culprit. Sophie paced the living room, her heels ticking against the wood floor, like a caged animal looking for an exit. And at my dining table, a stranger in a gray suit was bent over a stack of papers. My papers. What exactly is going on here? I asked, calmer than I felt. All three looked up. David's eyes darted away. Sophie forced a brittle smile. The man stood and offered his hand. Mrs. Keller, I'm Attorney Harris. David and Sophie asked me here to discuss your situation. My situation? I raised an eyebrow. I seem fine. My papers, however, don't look fine. Being rifled through by a stranger. David cut in, trying for gentle but shaking anyway. Mom, we're only worried about you. You've been acting strange, stopping transfers, not answering calls. We're afraid you're becoming confused and need a legal guardian. I went silent for a beat, then laughed. Not with joy, but with the clarity of someone who realizes she's watching a cheap play. A guardian? Ah, so the new plan is to turn me into a child so you can sign for my savings. Sophie stepped closer, voice sweet as syrup, eyes cold as glass. Martha, stop resisting. Everything you have will be ours eventually. We're just making the process a little faster. I met her gaze, a crooked smile on my lips. So I'm just a wallet on legs, is that it? The room went dead quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Sophie flushed, then smoothed her face back to neutral. Let's not be dramatic, Attorney Harris interjected. You're over 70. Clearly you need help managing finances. I'm simply here to assist you in signing a few power of attorney forms, entirely for your benefit. I walked straight to the table and yanked my documents from his hands. These are mine, and only I decide what happens to them. You don't touch a single page. David finally lifted his head, voice tight with grievance. Mom, we have a duty to step in. You're not as clear-headed as before. Cutting off our funds like that, that's not normal. I looked at him, my only son, the one I spent my life raising, and felt more estranged than from any passerby on the street. The only abnormal thing here, I said evenly, is a 35-year-old man relying on his mother's retirement money to pay rent. Sophie snapped, her voice sharp and high. "You're selfish. We have plans, responsibilities, bills to pay. You can't just turn your back on us." I stood tall, my eyes like ice. My obligation was to raise my son until he was 18. After that, his life is his. I'm not signing anything. And now, all of you, out of my house. Harris mustered a stiff smile and gathered his briefcase. But before reaching the door, Sophie spun around, fury sparking in her eyes. "You think you're clever? Fine. We'll prove you're incompetent in court. You will sign whether you want to or not." I stood there, my hand still on the door I'd just slammed behind them. In the empty room, Sophie's last words hung in the air like a curse. I knew this wasn't just a family matter anymore. This was a war, and the next battlefield would be the courtroom. After I threw them out, I sank into the armchair, my heart pounding. The familiar room suddenly felt foreign. The walls that once held our memories now only echoed Sophie's threat. "We'll prove you're incompetent in court." I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't whining for money anymore. This was a legal war, and if I didn't prepare, I would lose everything. The next morning, I went to a name I'd heard often among the seniors in town, Mr. Whitman. People called him the Mother's Shield, an older attorney, hair white as snow, eyes sharp as a razor. When I told him everything, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Keller," he said, voice low and steady, "you're facing what we call elder financial abuse. Sadly, it happens more than you think." I sat still, the word stinging like a slap. "You mean, my son isn't the only one?" Mr. Whitman met my eyes. "Unfortunately, no. The difference is you've recognized it, and you're still clear-headed enough to fight back. We need 3 things: paperwork, witnesses, and courage." The paperwork I had meticulously recorded every dollar I gave them. Witnesses. I thought immediately of Mr. Coleman at the bank and the staff who'd watched me make the transfers. But courage, I wasn't sure I had enough. I went home with a heavy heart and a sliver of relief. At least I had an ally now. That afternoon, I met someone else who would become my right hand. Her name was Eleanor Brooks, a neighbor who'd just moved in 2 houses down. I knew her vaguely from quick hellos, but that day she walked over when she saw me fumbling with the trash out front. "Mrs. Keller, I heard a commotion at your place yesterday. Is everything okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. I looked into her eyes. There was no cheap curiosity there, only the empathy I'd been starving for. I invited her in, and I don't know why, but the story just poured out. I told her everything: the secret wedding, the money I'd lost, David and Sophie's invasion, and Attorney Harris's threat. Eleanor listened quietly, nodding now and then. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Martha, I know exactly how this feels. 5 years ago, my daughter did the same thing. She only called when she needed money. When I refused, she said I was losing it. It took me a full year to prove I was still in my right mind. I was stunned. I wasn't the only one walking this dark road." From that day on, Eleanor became the confidant I never thought I'd find. We sat for hours at my kitchen table drafting what she called a survival plan. First, change every lock. "Don't forget," Eleanor said. "They used to have keys. They can come back any time. Second, install security cameras. Not because you're weak, because you need evidence. We have to turn truth into something undeniable. Third, document every call, every text, every visit. Don't keep it in your head. You need proof. Courts don't judge memories, Martha. They judge paper." We wrote it all down, step by step, like 2 generals preparing for battle. I looked at Eleanor, her eyes burning bright. and realized that beneath her austerity was a strength I wanted to learn. That evening, I held a new set of keys and an appointment for the camera installation. For the first time in months, I felt in control, no longer a puppet jerked by midnight phone calls. But before she left, Eleanor gripped my shoulders, her voice dropping, her gaze dark with warning. "Get ready, Martha. They don't just want your money. They want your life." Rumors spread faster than the flu. Within weeks of me cutting off the transfers, the whole neighborhood was buzzing about old Mrs. Keller losing her mind. They said I talked to myself, that I installed cameras around the house because I thought the neighbors were plotting against me. Someone even added that I hid my pills in a drawer and forgot to take them, so my mind was unraveling. I heard it all, and I knew exactly where it came from. No one but David and Sophie. When they couldn't drain my money, they started draining my reputation. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman in a business coat holding a folder. "Hello, Mrs. Keller. I'm from Social Services. We received reports that you're showing signs of cognitive decline and need evaluation." I stood still, hand on the door. "Who reported this?" I asked, though I already knew. She gave a polite, evasive smile, some family members and a few neighbors. I nearly laughed. Family, meaning David and Sophie. Neighbors, surely Mr. Davis, the man who's perpetually annoyed when my friends park near his curb. And the few others? I knew at once. The pharmacy. Sophie had roped the gentle pharmacist into signing some vague note about my unusual purchase habits. I looked the social worker in the eye. "You can sit in the living room," I said. "But before you ask a single question, I'm calling my attorney." 15 minutes later, Mr. Whitman arrived, suit a little rumpled from rushing. He set his card on the table. "Any questions will be addressed with me present." The woman flinched, then steadied herself. Even with counsel, Mrs. Keller must undergo a mental capacity assessment. It's mandatory. I nodded. Good. At least this time there'll be paper proving I'm not crazy. 2 days later, I met Dr. Moore, an independent psychologist the court often hires in disputes. About 50, small frame, eyes sharp, but not cold. From the first sentence, I knew I was facing not just a clinician, but someone perceptive enough to see through the smoke David and Sophie had blown. She began with the basics. "What's your name? What's today's date? Who is the current president?" I answered crisply and couldn't resist a touch of bite. Dates I remember. Money I remember even better. Unfortunately, my son remembers just as well, but only the account numbers. She arched an eyebrow and jotted something. Probably sense of humor. Intact. Then came long-term memory. She asked me to recount a major event from the past. I told her, detail by detail, about the day my husband Robert died. Even the small things like the wind through the hospital window and his last words, "Martha, live for yourself." Dr. Moore's gaze softened. "Your recall is clearly very sharp," she said. Finally, logical reasoning. A few problems, a few puzzles. I worked through them quickly, adding, "If my son were here, he'd stumble. He's more familiar with adding and subtracting my money than actual numbers." 2 hours later, I walked out with my head high. When Mr. Whitman asked, Dr. Moore summed it up. "Mrs. Keller is not only competent, she's sharper than many younger adults I've evaluated." That news reached David and Sophie fast. I knew, because my phone lit up that night. Calls nonstop, texts piling in. "Mom, why are you making this so hard?" "You're letting people take advantage of you. You think that lawyer's helping you for free." I read them all and deleted them. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I finally understood. Every line wasn't concern. It was the scream of people watching a cash flow dry up. When night fell, I sat alone in the kitchen sipping hot tea. My shadow stretched long and thin across the wall, but straight. I thought about everything they'd done, seeding rumors, recruiting neighbors, even duping a kind pharmacist, just to prove I'd lost my mind. I set the cup down and smiled, bitter and steady. I'm not crazy. But clearly they're crazy for money. On the day of the hearing, I wore the simple black dress Robert once said looked best on me. In the mirror, I saw a woman who has lived 71 years, a face lined with age, but eyes hard as steel. This wasn't the mother who trembled at her son's calls anymore. This was a living witness, ready to tell her story in blood and tears. The courtroom was packed. David sat on one side in a brand new suit, almost certainly not paid for by him. Sophie wore black, her makeup meticulous, looking every inch the grieving widow. I wanted to laugh. They'd turned the hearing into a stage, and I was supposed to be the villain. Their attorney opened in a voice smooth as honey. Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned about Mrs. Keller's mental health. Over recent months, she's exhibited unusual behavior, abruptly cutting financial support, installing cameras due to paranoia, alienating family. We simply want to ensure she receives proper care. Sophie started sobbing on cue, tears streaming. Martha has always been like a second mother to me. But lately she's completely changed. She doesn't recognize us. She treats us like enemies. We're afraid. She's losing her mind. Then David, head bowed, voice thick. Mom has always been the most important person in my life. I just want her safe. But when she cut off all money and refused to see us, we had no choice but to seek the court's help. I sat listening to every lie wrapped in counterfeit tears. Never in my life did I imagine my son would cry in court to seize guardianship of me. Then it was Mr. Whitman's turn. He stood and set a thick file on the table. Your Honor, we're not here to talk about worry. We're here to talk about facts. These are the bank records. $30,000 over 3 years transferred by Mrs. Keller to David and Sophie to support them. Does a cognitively impaired person make punctual transfers for 3 years and record every expenditure down to the dollar? Murmurs rippled through the room. I saw Sophie clutch David's hand under the table, her face draining. First witness, Mr. Coleman, the bank manager. He stood straight, voice calm. I personally handled all of Mrs. Keller's transactions. She's lucid, careful, and never made a mistake. If this is what decline looks like, I hope I decline the same way. A quiet chuckle moved through the courtroom. Sophie's lips tightened. The red lipstick looked chewed. Second witness, the locksmith who replaced all my locks. Mrs. Keller hired me herself and described exactly what she needed. Nothing unusual, other than wanting protection from someone who used to have keys. Next, Mr. Green, the pharmacist, face flushed with guilt. I signed a paper Sophie brought me, thinking it was for insurance. In truth, Mrs. Keller only bought vitamins and aspirin. I was misled, and I'm sorry. I nodded to him. Sometimes truth must be spoken, even late. Finally, Eleanor, my ally. She took the stand, gait steady. I've spent weeks with Mrs. Keller. We've talked, planned safeguards. A confused woman doesn't map out step-by-step protections like that. The only unusual thing I've seen is that her son and daughter-in-law appear only when money is involved. Scattered applause broke out despite the judge's gavel for order. Then it was my turn. I rose and walked to the stand, slow and steady. My hands trembled a little. My voice did not. I've heard my son and daughter-in-law say I've changed. They're right. I have. After $30,000, after too many nights eating instant noodles so they could make rent, I woke up. I don't regret stopping the payments. I only regret how long it took. The words sliced through the pretense. David lowered his head further. Sophie turned away, hiding the hatred in her eyes. Their lawyer tried to counter, asked about the cameras, about my cutting contact. I answered cleanly, plainly. I installed cameras to protect myself from people who had entered my home before. I cut contact because my phone had become an ATM with a ringtone. Your Honor, that's not mental illness, that's self-defense. The air in the courtroom thickened. I could hear the judge's pen etching strong strokes across the page. When the hearing concluded, the judge struck the gavel. The court will recess for 2 hours to deliberate. A ruling will follow. I returned to my seat, heart pounding like a war drum. I knew I'd said everything and brought every piece of evidence. But would justice stand with me? Or would their money and manufactured tears win? I looked up at the clock on the wall, the second hand crawling as if mocking my patience. And in that moment I told myself, my fate rests in one person's hands. With a single word from the judge, I will either keep my life or lose it. Those 2 hours of waiting felt longer than a lifetime. I sat in the courtroom with my eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door where the judge had exited. When he returned, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the judge declared, "The court finds Mrs. Martha Keller fully competent. The petition for guardianship is denied." The words landed hard and rang out like a bell of deliverance. My heart thudded, and for a moment I heard nothing but the cheering inside my head. I won. My life is still mine. I glanced at David. He stared down, unable to meet my eyes. Sophie was different, her face like ice, her stare at me pure hatred. I knew in that moment I had lost my only son for good. Strangely, I didn't feel empty. I felt relieved. As I left the courtroom, I heard Sophie whisper to David, "Don't think this is over. One day, she'll need us." I didn't turn back. Her threats had no weight left. I walked on, head high, my heels striking the tile like drumbeats for a new beginning. In the days that followed, I began erasing the traces of my past. The house, where I'd cried myself dry, felt suffocating. I listed it for sale without regret. With the proceeds, I bought a small apartment near downtown, bright, busy, a place where I wouldn't be trapped inside the cramped walls of memory. I replaced everything. The old sofa Sophie used to throw her legs over, gone. The dining table where Attorney Harris rifled through my papers, given away. Each item that left felt like dust being shaken from an old rug of recollection. I moved in with only a few things, some photos of Robert, the notebooks where I'd kept my records, and an easel I hadn't touched in years. On my first day there, I opened the windows and let the sun flood in. I set out paints and brushes and sat for hours before a blank canvas. My hand trembled at first, but stroke by stroke I felt myself return. I painted flowers, trees, and a woman standing in ash, holding a torch. I realized she was me. Eleanor stopped by often, bringing hot coffee and rambling stories. She laughed. "Martha, you look 10 years younger. Maybe freedom is the most expensive cosmetic of all." I nodded, quietly gratefully. I joined a new circle, women who'd also been exploited by their own families. We met, shared, laughed, sometimes cried. In each story, I saw pieces of myself, and I knew I wasn't alone. Then I started to travel. I went to Chicago to see my sister, to New York for the museums, and even booked Italy, the trip Robert once dreamed of taking me on. Standing before the Colosseum, staring at ancient ruins, I whispered, "Robert, I finally made it. Not with our son, but with myself." I sent photos to Eleanor and the group, Not one included David or Sophie. For the first time, I didn't feel the absence. I felt whole. Each night, back in my little apartment, I sat by the window watching the city lights bloom. I thought about the road behind me. My own children had turned me into a wallet, a crying ATM. In the end, I turned myself into a free woman. Free to live, to breathe, to love myself without permission. Free to spend what's left on what brings me joy, not on bottomless pits. I know life will never be perfect, but for the first time, I feel truly alive. And if Robert could see me, I believe he'd smile. Still, peace is never permanent. One morning, as I was making coffee, the doorbell rang. The mail carrier handed me a thick envelope, the corner stamped with the name of an unfamiliar law firm. I held it, a cold shiver running down my spine. Because every piece is fragile, until the day a letter arrives out of nowhere. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.